Something knocks on my front door every night at 12:16 a.m. It first happened last week, Thursday, March the 22nd. It was just after midnight and I was lying awake in bed when I first heard it. My first reaction was to look at my phone to see if someone tried calling or texting me, but there were no messages. I live alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I couldn't think of any good reason why someone would be knocking at that time, and I decided to ignore it. But then it happened again the next night at around the same time. I went downstairs this time, took a deep breath, and looked through the peephole. Nothing was there. I was getting a little weirded out at this point and decided again not to open the door. But if it happened again tomorrow, I'd be more willing to investigate. And it did happen again the next night. This time I made note of the specific time, 12:16 a.m. I was at the door in less than 10 seconds and promptly opened it. It was dark out there and it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Was something moving in the shadows near the bushes? No. There was nobody there. Nothing. I looked down the street in both directions but saw no movement. It was remarkably quiet out there, but I didn't hear any footsteps. I was confused. Who was knocking on my door every night? And for the first time, I didn't think who, but what. I thought back then to the day when the knocking first began and wondered if it was related. March 22nd. I was at a funeral that day, and I think I need to write a little about it here. It was for my friend Pete, my best friend growing up. From about 8 to 15, we were inseparable. We started to lose touch 15 to 20. The last time I'd heard from him at all was 12 years ago when we were both 22. The strangest thing about his funeral was this. Nobody else was there. Just me and a priest. He was reading an incoherent Bible verse when I interrupted him and asked him where everybody else was. He paused for a moment, looked at me, then went back to reading. It felt uncomfortable. I decided to leave. So, is that significant? Did I bring some spirit back with me from the funeral home? Or was I just losing my mind? I decided I'd try and be quicker the next night. I'd wait near the door and have it opened in seconds. I wouldn't allow any time for whatever it was to get away. But even this plan failed. It must have been a mere seconds after the knocking stopped before I opened the door. What would stand before me? Was it a neighborhood kid playing a prank? A mischievous spirit? A warning to me from the supernatural? All three options seemed equally unlikely. But again, it was just empty space. Silence. I had one more plan for the next night. I slipped outside at midnight and hid behind a neighbor's car across the street. I had a very clear view of my front door and I'd be able to see whatever is knocking. I remember ducking behind the rear bumper of his car thinking, what would my neighbors think if they see me? I looked at my phone. 12:15. It would happen any second now. I looked up and down the street for movement. I couldn't see anybody. I held my phone in front of me. I watched it turn to 12:16. And still, nothing was there. I was actually slightly disappointed for a fraction of a second. But then I heard it. But I'm 100% certain as I write this, nobody was there. I was looking right at my door, but what I did see for just a moment, and I can't be certain, was a shadowy figure moving away from my house. Not human, not even something real or tangible. It was as though a shadow was moving down the sidewalk. But even I acknowledge maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I have no idea. I have tried some other things the past few nights. I stood by my front door one night and recorded the knocks, and then played the recording to my coworkers the next day. I started thinking the knocking was just in my head, but they could hear it. They were confused as to why I was making them listen to it, but they could most certainly hear it. And then, 2 nights ago, I decided to beat the knocking to the punch. I stood with my phone in front of me and opened the door at precisely 12:16, just to see what would happen. But again, there was nothing there. In fact, the knocking didn't even happen this time. So if I stood with the door open at 12:16, the knocking would be prevented. What could that mean? And here's the stranger thing. The knocking did wake me up that morning at 7:07 a.m. Why 7:07 a.m. this time? Why wouldn't the knocking happen if I stood with the door open? I have no idea. I'm lost. I'm really, really lost. Last night, the knocking was back to its regular time at 12:16. This was the first time since March 22nd that I decided to just ignore it. And that leaves me here, writing this out for you all. What do I do next? Any ideas? Do I just go the rest of my life ignoring the knocking? I'm left very confused, because I can't help but think that maybe there's some sort of secret code I'm supposed to work out. There's the date, March 22nd. But also, what about the number of knocks on the door? It's always 3. Does that mean anything? The times the knocking occurs is always 12:16 and 7:07. Do those times represent something? If anyone thinks of anything, please comment below. I'll be reading and I'm open to advice. Maybe I can even try some of your ideas out tonight at 12:16 a.m. Something knocks on my front door every night at 12:16 a.m. Part 2. It's been 2 nights since I last posted. On the first of those nights, I simply ignored the knocking again. I was still reading through the comments on my no-sleep submission and trying to figure out what to do next. Some Redditors suggested that, given that the knocking didn't happen when the door was opened, that I just permanently leave my front door open. But that just seems ridiculous as far as I'm concerned. This is the front door to my house. Anybody could just walk in, let alone rats, raccoons, insects, etc. No, that wasn't a strong long-term solution. Others suggested ideas like setting up infrared cameras, leaving a fresh coat of paint on the door to see if prints are left, and even contacting a priest. I thought about maybe eventually resorting to those options. But a post by user House of Pwnecakes set me on a different path. He suggested I look at Bible passages that match up to the time the knocking occurred, 12:16 and 7:07. Specifically, Revelations 12:16 from the Bible was recommended. While I was unable to find relevance in that passage, it got me looking into other biblical passages. Acts 12:16. But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. I mean, that couldn't possibly just be a coincidence, could it? I had been at my friend Pete's funeral the first day the knocking began, and the passage directly references the knocking. The second time the knocking occurred was 7:07. After a little digging, I was able to find this passage. Matthew 7:7. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. The part I focused on was knock, and it will be opened to you. Does that mean I should knock back, as some Redditors suggested, and something will happen? If I put it all together, It appears that it really is the spirit of my former friend Pete who was knocking on the door. If I knock back and then open the door, what I see will be astonishing. I decided to give it a try last night. I was standing by my door at 12:15, waiting. I was looking at the clock, and when it clicked over to 12:16, I heard the same as usual. I raised my hand and knocked back immediately, 3 times. Then I opened the door, and I was astonished. What stood before me I could barely see. Light refracted off of it in a strange manner and made it difficult to focus on. It was mostly a shadow and somewhat transparent. It looked both somewhat familiar while at the same time alien from this world. It had a humanoid form but looked tormented, abominable, and odious. In my state of repulsion and fear, it took me a moment to recognize that somewhere deep down inside this monstrosity was what remained of my friend Pete. It was him, no question. He didn't speak to me. Instead, we could sort of see each other's thoughts. That's the best way I could describe it. And I saw all the evil that Pete had done. The reason that nobody other than myself showed up to his funeral. He had been a monster in his adult life. The worst that humanity had to offer. Rape, violence, torture, murder. I saw it all. Most of it he had never even been caught for. But it was a murder that eventually got him put in jail. He was killed there by another inmate. I saw myself at his funeral, alone, as the priest read aloud Genesis 3:22, describing when mankind first became aware of the difference between good and evil. And what happened next was an even worse experience. Both Pete and I were looking at the things that I had done wrong in my life. I'm not going to own up to them here. They may pale in comparison to what Pete had done, but I saw how extreme my flaws had become. How badly I'd been corrupted. The shadowy figure of what used to be my friend Pete held up a hand to wave. I saw the anguish and agony in his eyes, and then he vanished into thin air. I stood looking into the dark, empty yard of my house for at least a minute before quietly shutting the door. So what did all of this mean? Was it a warning? If I don't clean up my ways, I'll also one day become the torturous form that stood before me? How do I start? Should I yell from my window asking a kid to buy the biggest goose in town and deliver it to the Cratchit family? I've been thinking back to my childhood with Pete. Were there any signs of what he'd become? Why hadn't I ever heard about his crimes? How did I even hear about his funeral? I don't use any social media. I didn't receive a letter or a phone call. I just somehow showed up there. And why did he choose to come and warn me? Because we were friends? Because I was the only person to show up to his funeral? I wasn't sure. There wouldn't be answers. And then I figured out that there was only one thing I could do. Try and be better. I did receive another knock yesterday, and I'm certain it will be the last time he ever knocks on my door. One final message. It occurred at 5:17. It took a bit of digging, but it translates to 17:17 on the 24-hour clock. I looked at the passage I'm certain he was showing me and smiled. And I think I can make sense of it. I think it all makes sense now. Proverbs 17:17. A friend is always loyal, and a brother is born to help in time of need.